I'd like to talk about something that you think would be more common in the current discussion on climate change, global warming, energy production, fossil fuels, oil, hydroelectric, nuclear power, windmills, any type of solar, any type of power, for the world. In this current discussion on climate change and climate in general, and the current proposal for the Green New Deal, I would like to start by asking, before I talk about this category that is almost never discussed, but is very pertinent data that's out there. I'd like to start by first asking a philosophical question. Without getting into the debate about, is global warming real? Is it a hoax? Is it not happening? Is it proven, settled science? Do 98% of scientists agree that it's man-made and that it's catastrophic, as John Kerry stated and Obama, and that, as Ocasio-Cortez and others have stated, that we have 12 years left before this global climate catastrophe. I'd like to ask, when we think of these issues, what is our standard of value? Is our standard of value the planet for the planet's sake? Is our standard of value a particular climate? Is it a group or individuals, or what's the standard of value? And I would argue that the standard is and ought to be human flourishing, but that's not this typical standard, and it's not usually defined philosophically before any type of climate discussion or energy discussion of what is the standard. Well, if the standard is human flourishing, we can measurably see by what standard are people doing better. Are they being harmed by pollution? Are they being harmed by global warming? Are they being harmed by extreme weather conditions? Are they, and then not just take the harm and the risks, but actually offering cost benefit analysis of what's the net benefit of fossil fuels, being on a planet that's able to support billions of people at a higher standard of living than has ever existed on this planet, where most people lived until the 1800s in a condition of near starvation and less than $3 a day, and now that's not the norm. But I want to look at this category of climate-related deaths, and my argument is that our standard ought to be human flourishing. So pollution, or something like that, if pollution causes harm to another group or another individual, then the standard of human flourishing would say that that is a criminal act, or it's a tort, that someone's responsible for having harmed people. But pollution, just from producing and consuming, the production of waste and trash, we have to find some way to deal with that, and there's no planet for the planet's sake. The planet is to be used and utilized, and it produces, and it has this great potential that's been only partially unlocked. But let's look at climate-related deaths. So thinking of events like extreme weather events like floods, droughts, storms, wildfire, extreme temperatures, that are things that could kill people and have killed people. They kill people today and could kill people and have killed people throughout human history. And we're told that sometimes the climate is not the same as weather, but whenever there's fires or these extreme events like droughts, fires, we're told that this is the undeniable result of climate change, and it may be. But the questions we ought to be asking are, how many people die from climate catastrophes a year? And has that number increased, decreased, or remained the same? That's a fair question, and the data is out there, but this is almost never talked about. And here's some information that we're not usually shown in this discussion. This is deaths from climate and non-climate catastrophes, and the source is there at the bottom. And this is not a source for people who deny climate change. These are often government databases and facts that are easily found and duplicated on the internet. But the climate-related deaths have dropped dramatically since the early 1900s, really since the 19 teens and 20s. They've come down by almost 100%. And that's not an exaggeration, as I'm going to show. So you can see this line of non-climate related deaths, meaning things that are deaths from other extreme events like earthquakes, tsunamis, things, volcanoes. But then climate-related deaths, things that used to kill people more often, like hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, all those things, have come down. And it's not necessarily because those things have stopped happening. It's because investment in things like fossil fuels and other energy sources have caused a greater production for societies in general, that have created greater wealth, that have created a greater ability to withstand those things. Our houses now can withstand these type of extreme events better than houses and places and buildings could in the 1920s, the early 1900s. That's just one reason. So even though the reporting is better on mortality, and the weather and climate have not changed, there's still untamable events that have happened. The deaths have gone down, and they've been going down. They continue to go down dramatically, but you almost never hear about this. So when we're talking about the idea of climate change, there's the philosophy and the presupposition within that philosophy that it is wrong inherently to change climate or to cause anything to change. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it's wrong to change the climate if it's going to have an impact on human flourishing, if it's going to harm people, if it's going to impact people in a negative way. But just to change itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Cat's getting mad here. Here's another table, and the sources are there at the bottom. These can be easily found online. These are academic papers and sometimes government sources. But as CO2 emissions, which we're always told are a bad thing, as CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide has increased dramatically. The climate-related deaths have fallen by 98% worldwide, not just in the United States. So while there has been more CO2, the deaths have been coming down from climate-related deaths by 98%. So it's not what we should expect from the rhetoric, the narrative, is that this CO2 is going to lead to, this increased CO2 is going to, is not normal, and that it is undeniably scientific, that it's going to lead to disaster for humankind. At least they presume to say that it's a disaster against humankind, but you'll usually just say it's for the planet. The destruction of the environment. Inder Goklany, in his paper Weather and Safety, the amazing decline in deaths from extreme weather in the era of global warming. So this scholar went and calculated, and as best he could, the mortality rates from climate-related events, extreme weather, hurricanes, floods, fire, that type of thing. And this is what he found. He said aggregate mortality attributed to all extreme weather events globally has declined by more than 90% since the 1920s, in spite of a fourfold rise in population and much more complete reporting of such events. The aggregate mortality rate declined by 98%. So the aggregate mortality rate from climate-related deaths has come down over 90%. We have 4 times more people living on the planet, and they're living at a higher standard of living than has ever existed in human history. And we're never told this. This is despite the rising CO2. And this is not to say that more CO2 causes this, but it's to say that in spite of the predictions that have been made for the increased CO2, the predictions that it would lead to human catastrophe have been dead wrong and continue to be proven dead wrong. Droughts, which comprised about 60% of the cumulative deaths from extreme weather from 1900 to 2010, have fallen by 99.9% since the 1920s. Floods, which were about 30% of the deaths from extreme weather, decreased by over 98% since the 1930s. Storms, all kinds of extreme storms and just more moderate storms of heavy rainfall, were about 7% of the cumulative deaths from 1900 to 2008, but they decreased more than 55% just since the 1970s. So the deaths and the human impact of climate, which is a volatile thing and never a calm thing before the great production of fossil fuels and greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions, climate has never been this steady thing. It's been a volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous phenomenon all over the world. But the ability to withstand the negative effects of climate has been maximized greatly. And the impact and the deaths from climate have been greatly minimized over the last 100 years. And that's largely because of those investments in energies like fossil fuels, which we're told are the enemy, and nuclear power, and these things that have created the ability to create better ways of dealing with the climate, we're never told about. We're never given that side of the benefit of the cost-benefit analysis. We're just told this is the worst possible risk that could come from changing the climate. We're never told that the benefits may greatly outweigh the risks. Extreme weather climate deaths accounts for 0.07% of global mortality, and that number is falling. So if we take for our standard human flourishing, then this is a great time in terms of withstanding climate viability, livability, human impact. This is a great time to be alive in terms of climate, but that's not the messaging and that's not the narrative that most people hear, and it's not what most people believe, even though it is scientifically true and it can be easily demonstrated. So it's not whether or not climate change happens, and it's not whether or not climate change is a serious issue. It's what is the impact on human flourishing. And we'll see, it's not all that it's cracked up to be. It goes on in this study. Proponents of drastic curbs on greenhouse gas emission claim that such emissions cause global warming and that this exacerbates the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, including extreme heat, droughts, floods, and storms such as hurricanes and cyclones. But what matters is not the incidence of extreme weather events per se, but the impact of such events, especially the human impact. So again, just to close out here, the impact is not primarily if the climate is changed by human activity, but the human impact of those changes. Does it get better, worse, or stay the same? That, I believe, is the correct philosophical starting point for a discussion on climate.